This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends Collection. There is no original date given for this interview. The interview was conducted by Mrs. Mary B. Roberts. The interviewee is Mr. Owen Gilbert Harned, that's Harned, of Oklahoma City. This interview is being re-recorded on August the 14th, 1985 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener. There are 3 or 4 widely scattered spots in this interview where there are 1 or 2 little minor sound problems. However, they are on the original reel-to-reel tape, and it was not possible to remove them from the copy.
The lovely duplex of Mr. and Mrs. Owen Harned. Mr. Harned is to be our interviewee today. This is Mary Roberts, and I'm interviewing for the Living Legends, a project of the Oklahoma Historical Society. Mr. Harned is important in our aviation history, and since 1918 he has been interested in that subject. He was born in Oklahoma, traveled all over the world, and his occupation is pilot and also as aviation designer. He knew famous people such as the Lindberghs, Ms. Eleanor Roosevelt, and others that we will be asking about today on this tape. The next voice you hear will be that of Mr. Harned.
My name is Owen Gilbert Harned, Harned, the son of Delphus Green Harned and Uzeda Board Harned. My mother's name was Euzada Board, Board, Harned, Harned. I was born on a claim which my father obtained in the run of 1889 and is now located in Alfalfa County, Oklahoma. I was born in a sod house at the above address. My schooling and elementary schooling, was obtained in a rural school, which in those days included all grades from the first to the 8th. We moved from the farm in 1908 to Durant, Oklahoma, and my interest in aviation, I think, started when Cal Hoxie flew a pusher Curtiss airplane across the country, navigating by railroad tracks from the East Coast to the West Coast, which required more than 60 days to make the trip. The reason for the delay of his trip was he was continuously patching up and repairing this fragile airplane, because in rough landings in cow pastures and any place that was smooth, he did quite a lot of damage to his undercarriage, and In those days, of course, there was no such thing as an airport. Later, my father was president of the Bryan County Fair Board, and for $1,500 they obtained an aviator by the name of Art Smith to come in and make a 30-minute flight with a pusher Wright airplane. And from that time on, I built paper airplanes as a kid and was always interested in aviation. Then, in later years, when we became involved in World War I went to Post Field in special service and had my first instruction in a real airplane, which was a Curtiss JN-4D, affectionately known as the Jenny. My first instructor was Lieutenant Kenneth Walker, who made a career of aviation and was lost over Subic Bay in the Philippines when he was shot down by the Japanese. At that time, he was a brigadier general. My second instructor was a flight sergeant, Wayne Neville. And in flying the Old Jennies, they were, we thought, real airplanes, but they did have some tricky characteristics. And I remember after 10 hours of dual instruction, he got out of the plane one day and said, "Okay, Sarge, she's all yours. Take her around. And remember, keep the nose down, because if you don't fly her, she'll sure fly you." What prompted this remark was the characteristic of the Jennies in those days. If you stalled them, they would immediately fall into a tailspin, and it required from 1,000 to 1,500 feet to recover. And two, we hadn't heard of parachutes in those days. We didn't wear parachutes. From there, then when the war was over, Curtiss had a number of these JN-4s and the original crates, which they sold back, or the Army had these, which they sold back to Curtiss. And in this part of the country, they shipped them all to Love Field, Dallas, Texas, and they were still in their original crates. They offered the Curtiss Southwest Company, as this company was known, which was part of Curtiss Airplane and Motor. They offered these planes for sale for $800 in the crates as is. That means that they didn't put them together. We had to assemble them ourselves, and they furnished us with an instruction book for both the motor and the plane. And if we were fortunate and had a little mechanical ability, we could get the plane ready to fly in about 2 days. I bought 4 of these planes and sold them after barnstorming with each of them for around $1,200 and $1,400 a piece. and at that time was considered a pretty good profit. In our barnstorming days, we made all the little towns and advertised our circus, as we called it, by dropping handbills on these towns announcing the time we would be there and the price of the airplane flights. And if I remember, the majority of the time our fee was $3. And oh yes, 1920. So I stayed with the Jennies until 1924, and having sold my last one, I started looking for another job. In 1925, I went to work for Travel Air Manufacturing Company in Wichita, Kansas, of which Walter Beach was president and Lloyd Stearman was the chief engineer. Beach had replaced Clyde Cessna as president of the company, and the Travel Air was the first all-steel tube fuselage airplane in the country. We had pretty rough sledding for a long time because the banks thought anybody that was foolish enough to fool with airplanes was slightly nuts. So we finally, or Mr. Beach finally, went to Pratt, Kansas, and contacted a president of a bank out there who had a little more courage than some of the bankers in Wichita, and he bought $10,000 worth of stock. And with this, and then barnstorming on weekends, we managed to keep Travel Air afloat. And not only that, we sold all the airplanes we could build. Then in 1927, when Lindbergh made his flight on May 20th and 21st, that was a shot in the arm for aviation, not only in this country, but I think all over the world. And people everywhere wanted to get in to the aviation business. Now, prior to this time, there was no such thing as airports. What we looked for was a cow pasture or a smooth field, and for some unknown reason, the nicest, smoothest piece of pasture land you could find was right next to a cemetery. So, but after Lindbergh's flight, the cities began to talk about municipal airports. At the time that Lindbergh, after he returned, made his tour of the country, I remember on several occasions we would fly to where they were putting on a demonstration for Lindbergh's arrival. And at Tulsa, they had no municipal airport, and he landed at the old McIntyre field, which was a privately owned field east of Tulsa. In those days, the field at Oklahoma City was a piece of prairie with sod turf and no runways. And I remember that they had three fellows in Oklahoma City who was in the aviation business. One was Burl Tibbs. Another was Bob Tarbutton, who had a field north of the Capitol on the west side of Old 77. And the third was a young fellow by the name of Paul Braniff, who was an Eagle Rock dealer. And of course he was a competitor of mine because at that time I was selling Travel Airs. Now, later on, Braniff started an airline using Stinson tri-motors. And eventually, his brother took over the company and they went to Ford tri-motors in later years. But I'm getting a little ahead of my story. I had met him. I wasn't personally acquainted with him, and I knew him when he was flying for Robertson Aircraft, which was they were dealt in aircraft and aircraft parts at Lambert Field in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was flying airmail from St. Louis to Chicago. He was one of a number of pilots, and they were flying the old de Havilland 4Bs, which was originally was a British-built plane, but we had they had Liberty 12 engines in them, so V12s, built by the Packard Company, and they developed 300 horsepower. Then in 1928, Lindbergh was coming across country and flying a Curtiss Falcon, which was a military type biplane, and on landing at the old Richards Field in Kansas City, he washed the undercarriage out and damaged the plane to such an extent that it had to be repaired. He came on to Wichita, and I had just returned from New York with our first monoplane, which I'd been demonstrating in New York, and he borrowed this plane, and we found out later that he flew to Mexico City, where he was courting Anne Morrow in this monoplane. Now, this was the same plane in which I had the pleasure of giving Eleanor Roosevelt her first ride in the air when she was the First Lady of New York State.
Was that on one of your barnstorming?
No, this was when I was selling planes as a sales manager for Travel Air. This came about by in January of 1927. We went to Tampa, Florida, to the dedication of what's called Drew Field. It was a man by the name of Drew donated a bunch of old pine timberland for an airport. And that was after Lindbergh's flight, of course, and so they cleared it off. And while I was there, I met John Boyd Thatcher and his wife and daughter, who were vacationing over at St. Petersburg, and he was mayor of the city of Albany. A few weeks after we returned home, I had a call from Mayor Thatcher asking if I would come back to Albany and design an airport for them, which I did. And and
What was your first airport?
it, that was the first. So we cleared off. They had acquired land from the old Shaker religious sect. So they cleared it off, and then the following June 8th, they had the dedication of this airport, and of course I had to be there for the dedication, and I was flying this monoplane, which later Lindbergh used. And late in the afternoon, Thatcher and his wife, Mayor Thatcher and his wife and daughter was out, and here a big Packard Phaeton drove up with a couple of military men driving it, and I had no idea who it was, but Mr. Thatcher said, came and got me, says, I want you to meet some friends of mine. So I went over, and it was Franklin Roosevelt and his wife, who at that time was governor of the state of New York. So I asked him, invited him to take a ride with me. He declined, and of course, me not knowing that he was crippled, I'm sure it was a reason that he declined the invitation, but she jumped at the opportunity. And I must say, was one of the most gracious women whom I've ever met. I still remember that flight because it was we had the most unusual cloud formation. She sat up front with me, and Mr. Thatcher, Mayor Thatcher and his wife and daughter sat in the back. And we had a low cumulus cloud that we ran into at about 1,000 feet. Then I pulled up above that, and we had another strata of cloud. And they were in entirely different formation. And we climbed up through those, and above those we had towering thunderheads. And they formed, if you can imagine, mountains with deep valleys. I flew down these valleys, and Ms. Roosevelt was thrilled to pieces. So I think it was one of the most beautiful flights I ever made, and that I am sure was Eleanor Roosevelt's first flight.
Pressurized at that time?
No, we couldn't get high enough in those days to pressure. You wouldn't need pressure. We couldn't get over 10, 12,000 feet. But nowadays they're flying at 35,000 feet, and they've took 35,000 and you can't see anything. They've took all the fun out of flying because we used to fly over these farmyards and see the chickens run and the kids come out and look, and it was a lot of fun.
Well, they'd accuse you of buzzing now if you flew that low.
Oh yes, it'd violate the. So later on in 1927, the government licensed all the pilots.
When was that?
Later on in the fall of 1927. So my license number, my pilot's license number was transport pilot number 226. 226, and my A&E, which is airplane and engine mechanics license number, was 212. And when you consider the fact there's considerably over 1 million licenses issued today, why, it was fairly early.
You came pretty early in it.
So,
Now, do you keep that same number year after year?
oh yes, and until I retired. Now then, I continued in the company, then moved me down from Albany, where I was headquartered at Albany.
And that's still travel air?
Oh yes. Then in latter part of 28, we merged with Curtis Wright. And then the Depression years came on, and the bottom fell out of everything, including aviation. And so in 1934, I retired from aviation permanently. So that is my story so far as my flying was concerned.
Well, we have lots we want to ask about that now. Let's go back to some of your experiences in flying and landing in these pastures. That sounds like a dangerous profession
Well,
to me.
there wasn't any airport. You couldn't.
I know,
You
but
couldn't land there.
how did you judge your pass? How about the time you flew?
Oh, you could see it. You could fly down. Now those airplanes those days, they landed at 45 miles an hour, and if you had a 20 mile an hour wind, well, your speed was about 25 miles an hour that you landed, and your top speed was around 90 miles an hour. That was with the Old Jennies. Of course, now when we got to travel there with the OX5 engine, why we had cruising speed of 110 miles an hour, as compared to the speed nowadays. Which,
That was tremendous then, wasn't
oh
it?
yes, oh yes.
So about the time you flew along the Canadian jungle.
Did what, honey?
Time you along the Canadian jungle.
Oh yeah, I had forgotten. We built a little biplane with a mail compartment all in front of the pilot's cockpit, and I took this to Montreal to demonstrate it to Colonel Mulock, who was the president of the Canadian Eastern Airline. Well, the night before, in a blinding snowstorm, they had the misfortune of losing two Fairchild planes that they were flying the mail in, and so they didn't have any equipment to fly the mail to St. John, New Brunswick. So big-hearted me, I told Colonel Mulock that he was welcome to use my plane for the mail, because that way I could make a good demonstration, and that if he cracked the airplane up, it was mine. He had nothing to worry about. So he accepted, and a young pilot, a British pilot by the name of Church, flew my plane and carried the mail to St. John, New Brunswick, and returned the same day. And that's the first time they'd ever made a round trip on this one day. Well, I was there on St. Hubert's Airport out at Longueuil, in the eastern part of Montreal, and they had a nice big airport. And they had just recently completed construction of a huge tower in the middle of the field that they were going to anchor the R-100 to when it came over, which was a dirigible, when it made its trip from England. Well, of course, in test flights, it broke in two over Hull, England, and so it never got here. But I noticed that there was a Royal Mountie. Every place I went, this Royal Canadian Mountie with his bright red jacket on, and every place I went, why, he seemed to be just a little ways behind me. So late in the afternoon, we were watching to the east, and finally I saw this plane showing up. And when he was convinced that it was my plane, he very politely tapped me on the shoulder and says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Harned, but your airplane will be seized immediately upon landing, and you won't be able to take responsibility of it." And I played dumb, asked him why I couldn't understand. And he said, "Well, can you imagine an American plane with an American license carrying His Majesty's mail?" So they had it tied up for 10 days, and finally they released it to me with the proviso that I clear Canada, which I did. But in so doing, I sold 10 airplanes.
Well, that was a good play after all, wasn't it?
Then another time, I after our merger, by loaning, built an amphibian. It was a biplane with a pusher motor, had a big right whirlwind engine, but it was pusher type. And I flew it to Ottawa and demonstrated it to the Royal Canadian Air Force at Ottawa. Among the passengers, I had a president of Jackson Curtis Banking House, who was one of the bankers who promoted the Curtis Wright merger.
How many could you carry?
6 in the amphibian. But also, I just had Mr. Reed, Stuart R. Reed, and one of his salesmen, Gus Fairchild. Well, it was a strong south wind, and those things were logy and slow. You couldn't make any time, but he had to be in New York at 8 o'clock that night. So I guess I was going to be the local Lindbergh. I was going to get him there. So I got down by flying right above the Hudson River, right above the water, and I got down between Storm King Mountain and Poughkeepsie, and Lindbergh, I was going to get him there. So I got down by flying right above the Hudson River, right above the water, and I got down between Storm King Mountain and Poughkeepsie, and a downdraft hit me and put me into the water, so we flipped. Well, we wound up in Vassar Brothers Hospital in Poughkeepsie, and needless to say, Mr. Reed didn't keep his appointment at 8 o'clock that night.
Well, you tried. In these early planes, how did you judge directions and so on, unless you flew the railroad track?
We finally had compasses, a magnetic compass only, and you could fairly well figure your course if you could see. But now, when you got above the clouds or in fog, why, you just didn't fly.
And of course, there were no night facilities, no night landing or night
No.
flying.
Now later on,
When did that begin, back when?
I think it was well, National Air Transport was the first one air mail line that started Chicago and terminated at Dallas, and it flew through here. And they had beacons, revolving beacons, ever so far, if you remember.
Yes, I remember.
And that's what they flew by at night, and they depended on a compass too. And but they had those beacons.
They couldn't fly at night with those.
If it was clear, they could follow those beacons. But
Is that where they got the expression of flying on the beam?
yeah, no, really it wasn't. That was Bill Lear developed what they called a transponder, a directional transponder, and as long as you were on your course, it was long dashes. If you got to the left, it was 2 dots.
Now that's on your panel.
It was audible.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
It was audible. You got 2 dots.
I see.
And if you were to the right of your course, you got a dot and dash, just like Morse code.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as you was on your course, well, you got that
Regular beam.
and then later on, why, they got the radio beam where they improved on their compasses and navigational instruments, and then finally when they got radar, why, that whipped it.
Well, I missed my first airplane ride. They told me that man was going to fly by the seat of his pants, and I'd have none of it.
Well,
It was in a little pasture in an airport in Texas, and one of my father's parishioners paid my fare. But I never went up. I wasn't
Well.
going with any guy that flew by the seat of his pants.
Well, really, that was the expression we used because we didn't have any. You had to fly by feel.
Well, nobody explained it to me.
You had to fly by feel. Uh, you didn't have an airspeed indicator. Now on these old Jennies, all you had on that was an oil pressure gauge, and there was a place for a magnetic compass, but it was optional. And you had a boy's motometer out on the radiator cap to watch your temperature. You didn't have it in the dash like your cars have. And you had a gas gauge, and you had a 21-gallon gasoline tank. And at 1400 RPM, they developed their full horsepower, and you used about 9 gallons of gasoline an hour. So after 2 hours' time, you looked for a place to land.
Yes. Well, compared to the airspeed and the elevations that we can make now, about what was the difference then and now?
Oh, as much difference as there is in daylight and dark. Where we were flying, now in the travel airs, when we got to cruising 110 miles an hour, we thought that we were really flying. Now then, our Boeing 707s and 727s and all the airlines, they are capable of flying at the speed of sound, but they hold them back because of the boom. And that's against the law.
Boom. Aren't they going to have to be equipped some way, somehow?
Well, I don't know, but now this is my own personal observation. How are you going to do it? Because that's what it's the sonic boom that causes thunder. That lightning streak is so fast. There's no way to estimate its speed. But as air comes back together, that creates a boom. Now then, the other day, that S1, which nobody knew that we had such a plane, it flew from Boston to London in an hour and 45 minutes.
I didn't hear that.
And then it took off and flew from London to Los Angeles in 3 hours and 24 minutes. And its cruising speed was over 1,800 miles an hour. Well, your sonic boom at sea level is a little over 600 miles an hour.
It must have been tremendous.
And it did some damage out on the west coast, but they throttled back over the Rockies and coasted on in. And they first said that they didn't create a boom, but they admitted later that they did, and they did some damage to some houses out there. So the Air Force assumed responsibility.
How about your air tour of 1930?
Oh yeah, we that was that Ford Reliability Tour. We started at Detroit, and we had regular night stops all the way. We went to from Detroit, West Chicago, up to Minneapolis and Duluth, and across to. Oh, am I still on? Across to Grand Forks, then Grand Forks to Winnipeg, Winnipeg to Brandon, and Brandon to Moose Jaw, and Moose Jaw to Saskatoon, and Saskatoon to Winnipeg, and then from Winnipeg south to Calgary, and Calgary to Lethbridge. We cleared at Lethbridge for the United States, then to Grand Forks, and from Grand Forks to Cheyenne, down to Denver to Colorado Springs to Garden City to Wichita, and Wichita to Enid, and that's the picture you saw, and that is as far south as we went, and then went on back way of Springfield, St. Louis, and on back to and wound up at Detroit, the starting point.
What Uh, this was a Ford reliability tour. That's all right. That's what I wanted you to explain. Was it a new plane they were trying out?
Oh no, it was all the manufacturers participated. We had Fokkers and Ford Tri-Motors and Wacos and Laird and Ryans and all the commercial aircraft manufacturers participated in it. And of course, first prize was $25,000 and a handsome trophy. Now then, there's another thing that I didn't mention. You see, we built the Woolaroc for Phillips Petroleum Company, which Art Goebel flew on the Dole air races to Honolulu. They're the first one to fly from nonstop from the West Coast to Honolulu, and that Dole prize was $25,000 prize. And we built the Oklahoma, which Bennett Griffin and Al Henley flew, but they went out of the way and turned around and came back. Really, I think they got chicken, just between you and me. But Art Goebel and his navigator made it, and Larry Jansen, he would have made it, but he missed, and then he turned around and came back, and he came in from the back side, and he was flying a Waco, and I'm satisfied had he not gotten a little lost, he would have probably been first. And the Woolaroc is now in Woolaroc Lodge up at Bartlesville on display, and it will always be there, I guess, until and that was sponsored by Phillips Petroleum, or Frank Phillips personally. And we start talking as I forget a lot of things. There's things that come to me, but we had a lot of fun, and I remember one time I was delivering a plane down to J.B. King at Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I landed down at Shreveport, and it wasn't an airport, it was just an ordinary field, and there was a chug hole that I didn't see in the grass, and I hit it so hard that I bent one of my center section struts and just collapsed it. So I had to loosen the wires on the center section where I get the strut out, and I took the thing and went down to the Ford garage and found a piece of exhaust pipe that I could bend that would fit inside this streamlined strut, and put it back together and used it. Went on to Florida with it.
I've heard it said that you could patch those things with a piece of baling wire generally, with almost anything.
Oh yeah, I did. On that Ford Reliability Tour coming into Grand Forks, was Grand Forks? Coming out of Lethbridge, our first stop in Montana, this Ford Tri-Motor, it was flown by Harry Russell, a Ford pilot, and our plane, our Kingbird, was neck and neck, and we was all diving to try to get across the finish line first, and all at once it sounded like an explosion, and I happened to realize that I'd pulled all the fabric off the top of the fuselage. In manufacturing the plane, they were supposed to put herringbone tape on top of the fabric and then lace it with linen, heavy linen thread. They had left the herringbone tape off. Well, the thread and with the suction just pull right through the fabric. So that's when they were I only had 2 hours to make repairs. So I went in the tin shop and got a piece of tin, corrugated iron, just exactly the measurement I wanted. went back out and drilled holes and used baling wire to lace it around the longeron to the fuselage. And we had carried a can of paint just for emergency use. So I had the right color paint, so I painted it blue and went all around with it.
So when you landed just good as new then.
Oh, yeah.
uh,
The Ford Tri-Motor beat us out, but we won second place.
you won second place.
Yeah.
Let's get that on.
The Ford Tri-Motor in this tour was first, but we came in second. And it didn't amount to very much, except we completed the tour. And the old Kingbird, the old Curtiss Wright Kingbird, which was a twin-engine plane, was the first one of its kind, and it was an experimental job. And it was very stable and a pleasure to fly.
I'm going to have to turn this tape, and then I want you to tell me something about this mystery plane. I see in your mementos that that you have an award on that, and I understand you had something to do with the design on that one. Just a minute, let me turn this tape.
Regarding what we called our Mystery S, which was a low-wing monoplane, which at that time was the most streamlined plane in existence. It was a single-place plane, all plywood covered. I mean, weatherproof plywood. On top of this plywood it was covered with fabric and doped with nitrate dope, and then finished and polished to a high finish. And at the Cleveland Air Races in 1929, competing with a number of commercial planes as well as the high-powered service planes, which included the Navy, the Army, and the Marine Corps. Our Mystery S came in a lap and a half ahead of all the other planes, even though the pilot thought he had cut a pylon a little too close, so he made a complete circle and then came in a lap and a half ahead of all the rest of the plane, and naturally he won the race. And in so doing, at that time he set a world land speed record of what was then the astonishing speed of 224 miles per hour. Later, we built one of these planes for Texaco, they flew all over the country advertising Texaco, and was piloted by Frank Hawks. And later we built one for Shell Oil Company, headquartered in St. Louis, and it was flown by Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy was a practical pilot and had quite a knowledge of engineering, so he attempted to clean the plane up and redesign it so as to get a little more speed out of it, and in so doing he weakened it structurally, and it flew to pieces in the air. But he survived by parachute. So that ended our experience with the Mystery S ships, because they had no commercial value and they were strictly a racing airplane.
I believe you have a replica of that plane among your memoirs here. Was that the one that? Uh-huh. Describe that for us.
Well, I did. It's a low-wing monoplane with it's a low-wing monoplane with streamlined. At that time, was the most streamlined plane in existence. And had we had a retractable undercarriage, which we did not have, we probably could have picked up another 20 or 25 miles an hour speed. But we didn't know enough to retract the undercarriage in those days.
So you just say it was stable.
Oh, yes, very stable. Very stable and maneuverable. In fact, Charlie Lawrence, who designed the Wright engine originally, I was standing alongside of him at Cleveland on this particular day, and Doug Davis, after he completed the race, he came over the crowd real low and then pulled straight up, and he went for about 5,000 feet and then did a chandelle turn with it.
What's a chandelle turn?
And a chandelle turn is when you pull up and roll, do a half roll, and wind up going the opposite direction to which you were originally headed.
Yeah, with a flip over.
No, he didn't flip over. Just pulled up and did a drop, a turn, and straight over. Just a half. Really, it was a half roll.
Mm-hmm. And
It was very maneuverable.
And this is because you flew this on this beautiful plaque. Tell us about it.
Well, that was a replica of the plane which they gave all of the executives of the Curtiss Wright Company, especially Travel Air. And this is a list on this plaque here, is a list of all the companies involved in the Curtiss Wright Corporation.
Oh, I see.
So, which include Wright Aeronautical, Travel Air, Keystone, which was military contractors, Moth Aircraft, Air Terminals Incorporated, New York, and Suburban Airlines Incorporated, Curtiss Airplane and Motor Company, Curtiss Robertson Aircraft Company of St. Louis, Curtiss Caproni Corporation, Curtiss Flying Service, Curtiss Airports, and Curtiss Airplane Export Corporation.
A race with Howard Hughes?
Oh, that was in that stagger wing. After that, he flew up alongside us.
Well, where were you? What were you doing?
I've been out to the Aviation Country Club at Hicksville, New York, and he had just took off. And Howard Hughes was a good pilot.
Well, tell her about that.
At the dedication of Mines Field in Los Angeles, it's an international airport out there now, but originally it was Mines Field. And that's where we started the cross country for the Cleveland Air Races in 1929. Among all of the pilots, Howard Hughes was flying a little Boeing, a single-seater biplane, which was designed for a shipboard fighter. And it was designed to carry two 250-pound bombs under the wings, and had a Lewis machine gun. Of course, on this plane that Howard Hughes was flying, he bought it for strictly commercial plane in his own personal use. And needless to say, he was a darn good pilot. In fact, he built, during the war, the largest airplane ever built was built entirely of plywood. And the reason for it was the government thought they might run out of material to build a conventional airplane, and this was entirely an experiment. And then he, if you remember, he flew the Curtiss Condor and the Lockheed Electra around the world in later years. I don't remember the date, but he was an exceptional pilot, and until later years he was very friendly, and we met him saw him nearly all the air meets. He didn't tell us anything. He just kept motion for us to open it up. I had it wide open then.
Tell us about that.
One time at Hicksville, New York, we took off with a Beechcraft Staggerwing, and it was a six-place job. And they had Dick Hoyt, who was president of Hayden Stone and Company. He'd married Charlie Hayden's daughter, and they were out there, and I was taking them for a ride, and Howard Hughes came up alongside of us in this little single-seater Boeing, and we had advertised this thing at a certain speed. Well, with a heavy load, it wouldn't quite do it, so he flew up alongside of us, and he motioned to open it up, keep it going. Well, I was had it wide open then, so he finally flew off and left us.
I noticed that in the article written from the from the Stillwater paper, an interview that you gave, I believe, to that gentleman. I noticed that you mentioned that something about the navigation. How that the navigation was achieved by about 2 or 3 instruments only back in those early days. What were those?
We had an airspeed indicator, and on this reliability tour, I had a Colesman directional compass, which I prefer over it was magnetic, but you set your course and then fly with your needle over these parallel marks, and you're on your course. And I prefer that to the conventional compass, but we had no radio or radar communication.
I find in one of his scrapbooks here an interesting thing, an airplane. I'm going to get him to tell us about it. The name on it is very familiar.
I almost omitted some information about the time that we went to the dedication of Mines Field at Los Angeles. At the air races out there, I had the good fortune of contacting Wallace Berry, Clarence Brown, and Howard Hawks, who was a famous director in the movies out there. And just a week before, I found out that Wilbur May had a new Stearman biplane, and with a Wright Whirlwind 300 horsepower motor in it, and he cranked it without any having the brakes on. It got away from him, and nosed over and completely washed the airplane out, but outside the motor wasn't hurt. He bent his prop. So I went up to see him in his office there at May Company and told him who I was and why I was there, and told him if he'd let me sell him an airplane, I'd buy a suit of clothes because I needed one. So we made a deal, and he put his motor in a boxcar and shipped it to Wichita, and we built him a monoplane.
The way you bandy these big names around keeps me searching my mind as to where we're next on that. Um, this is a wonderful scrapbook. All of these models and planes that you have here.
When I was telling you about my experience with the mail plane in Canada, it so happened that John Bain was the president of General Motors of Canada, and his son-in-law was a good friend of mine. So I thought I could prevail on John Bain. Maybe he had enough political pull that he could get my plane released. And what you would call the Attorney General down here, Mr. Bain, contacted him, and he called me at the hotel. And he said he was just terribly sorry. He appreciated what a wonderful thing I had done, but that was a law in Canada and just couldn't do anything about it. So there was no political pull up there. So I have a lot of respect for the Canadians.
I believe your wife just remarked that this is going back a bit, but I feel it's important. And that is that your father was a member of our Constitutional Convention in Oklahoma. Do you remember as a child his telling you anything about it?
I remember that I believe it was the 9th District from which Brave Major, Alfalfa, and some of those other counties up there. Of course, it was all new territory. Before that time, it was a territory. And this Constitution was held at Guthrie in 1907, and that was the birthplace of Oklahoma, really, so far as the state was concerned. And outside of some of the so far as the state was concerned. And outside of some of the photographs which I have donated to Historical Society at Guthrie and the committee in which he was on, I don't have any other information here. Now, on that committee, he was on the committee for the 5 civilized tribes and Indian affairs, and among a number of prominent Indians was Bill Durant and Quanah Parker, and Dr. Bill Newell and my father, but they were the only ones that I really knew. But there was a number of Indians who had their big black hats and all wore the hair in braids. And yeah, and the picture is up there, and I imagine that artist up there, he said he was going to paint some of those Indians. So I feel that that's something that will live as long as they have a historical society, and I shall always regret that they tore the city hall down where the Constitutional Convention met in Guthrie.
Well, Owen, he gets to talk about it, and he tells things that I
Well, we'll call on him for some more stories presently then. I'm having some assistance here from Mrs. Harned, the wife, and she's prompting on some very interesting information here that in my reading I hadn't found. So I appreciate anything that you can suggest. But she's thinking. um, do you remember something about, I remember Will Rogers, for instance, mentioned it in one of the tapes that we have copied from his tapes in Claremore. And he mentioned about how that he always caught a ride. He was a hitchhiker from California on those early mail planes when they wouldn't let anybody else, they didn't take passengers and wouldn't let anybody else. But if Will had to go in without their knowing it, why, he hung a ride on one of those.
I do remember Will Rogers quite well. In fact, I met him several times, and he was always, no matter where you met him, he was always reading the newspaper. And when you looked in the front cockpit of the plane he was riding in, and the floor was covered. I do remember Will Rogers quite well. In fact, I met him several times, and he was always, no matter where you met him, he was always reading the newspaper. And when you looked in the front cockpit of the plane he was riding in, and the floor was covered with newspapers. And I also remember Wiley Post. The first time I ever met Wiley Post was back in the early part of 28. We built an OX-5 biplane and painted it all white for Hall and Briscoe, who were oil operators at Chickasha. And the pilot who came to take delivery of it was Wiley Post. And that's the first time I ever met Wiley Post, but I met him several times after that. And then after some of his epic flights, I met him on several occasions at the municipal airport at Newark, New Jersey, where he kept his Winnie Mae. Incidentally, the first airplane, the white OX-5 we built, was also Christian, Winnie Mae.
And Ann Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart, just listen here.
This is hashing this all up. So many things that you don't remember until you start talking. But during the 29 air races, I almost forgot. Hugo Eckner and his son Kurt had just arrived at Lakehurst with Graf Zeppelin Hindenburg, and we had sent the race committee, or Goodyear had sent a plane over at Lakehurst to pick Hugo Eckner and his son up. They brought them over, and the Goodyear blimp came down and landed in front of the grandstand, and Hugo Eckner and his son and Charles Lindbergh and Ann, his wife, got in the gondola of this thing, and they cruised all around over the city of Cleveland during the air races there. Oh, I met Amelia Earhart on several different occasions. The first time I met her was in Miami, Florida, at an air meet there, when she was flying an autogyro. It was built by Pitcairn in Philadelphia. And now the autogyro is similar, but is entirely different than a helicopter. A helicopter is geared directly to the motor. The autogyro has little short stubby wings to give it stability, and a motor mounted in front just the same as a tractor type airplane. And in order to get the rotor turning fast enough to give you a lift, you have to tax it around in a circle. And finally, you'll get enough lift on this rotor that it will lift, and then your little stubby wings stabilize it. And in the event of a forced landing, the slower you go, the faster the rotor turns, so you can almost make a vertical landing with it. She was flying it. She flew them for. Met her at Los Angeles, and she's flying a Lockheed out there. And I think it was the same Lockheed in which she made her transatlantic flight.
Is that her final flight?
Beg pardon?
Her final flight?
Oh no. This is several years before that. She made all the air meets, and she was certainly a genteel lady. She was a perfect. At Cleveland. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, he gets to talking and he brings up more people.
As I said, it. Well,
One time after that, of course, we kept
his wife tells me that we've skipped some of these stories on Wallace Beery. We're going back just a little bit.
I'm sorry. When I sold Wallace Berry his monoplane, our dealer, H.C. Lippiat, was pretty well known among the movie colony out there, so he made an appointment with Wallace Beery at his home. So we went to his home about 8 o'clock at night. And when we rang the doorbell, finally there was a little slit opened in the door, and it had one of these one-way glass in it, so he could see out, but we couldn't see in. And he let us in and apologized. And he said the reason that he was so late letting us in that there's too many process servers trying to serve him. So we went in and had a very nice, pleasant visit with him, and we got an order for this monoplane. And that's how I happened to meet Wallace Beery. Yeah, and when he came to Wichita, the company had sent me back to New York, and I happened not to be there, so they gave a big party for him, the Chamber of Commerce and heads of the various aviation companies, which was Swalla and Stearman and Travel Air and Cessna and all of everybody who was sitting at the head table, and Wallace Beery was a guest of honor. And they said that he looked all around the room, and finally he raised up and looked, and he says, "Well, where in the hell's Harned?" And so I missed seeing him, but I had the pleasure of meeting him and selling him an airplane, and yeah, really I sold him to a biplane and this monoplane.
You must have been a good salesman at least on this. Um, I wondered if uh, in the days when the airplanes carried the mail, uh, did they regard it something like the Pony Riders did, and that is the mail must go through?
When National Air Transport started the mail service from Chicago to Dallas, VIA Wichita, Oklahoma City, and Dallas and Fort Worth, they started that service with what they call big, cumbersome Curtiss carrier pigeons. They were big biplane with a Curtiss D12 motor. And the unique thing about these planes were that the rudder and the elevators and the ailerons were all interchangeable. And you could take, if you boogered up a rudder, you could take an aileron and use it as a rudder. And it was a cumbersome airplane, and a friend of mine who was piloting one of them told me that it had a gliding angle like a brick. So they weren't very popular with the pilots who flew them. And it wasn't long till after that until they went to the Douglas O2 biplanes, and they were sweet flying airplane, and the pilots were crazy about them.
I have here in my hands this picture made in 1918, I believe you said. But underneath it, there's a strange thing which must be very prophetic. It says, tomorrow, the moon. You mean in those days they actually were thinking of such?
They had, whoever thought of that, we had made such an advance in air travel, and that was one of the titles written underneath an old JN4D Jenny. And I don't think that whoever made that prediction ever suspected that I'm sure they didn't know anything about rockets or rocket propulsion, but it was certainly true that tomorrow it was the moon, and no one knows what yet will be happening tomorrow.
I just started to ask you for a little prophecy. You have the background now from a way back where we first started. I noticed here on the back of your picture is the description of the airman who, with his jaunty, nonchalant goggles high on his helmet, he followed the carnivals and the fairs and the circuses, hedge-hopping his faithful Jenny over the countryside. He recognized no limitations with a nearly blind trust in his machine. This wanderer introduced flying to the thrill-seeking public, inveigling many to fly who had never before even seen an airplane. From that date, say about 1918, we've come far. Now, can you say something about what the future is going to be? I hadn't been through the Dallas airport, for instance. Let's take in airports too on this. Until about 3 months ago, I landed there when I hadn't landed there for 2 years.
Did you land at the new airport?
I landed at that new airport. To me, I don't think that's the kind of an airport that we want to have.
No, and a lot of people who, in fact, some of the airlines have moved or are talking of moving back to Love Field. Now, I remember Love Field when it was all just grass turf. There was no runways, and everybody you didn't expect anything differently. We thought that was good enough. And right in the center of Love Field, back during the First World War, there was a water tower that sat right in the middle of the field, and no one thought anything about it. And I can't imagine a water tower now in the center of any municipal airport, but that was true of Dallas. I also remember one time a good friend of mine, Tom Harden, who was an exceptional pilot, and in one of the hangars they had an old British, what's called an SE-5. It was had a Gnome-Larone motor engine in it, which was a rotary type engine. It turned with a propeller, and it hadn't been flown for quite a while, and of course they were all wood propellers in those days. So he took the thing up, and he was flying that thing, and finally the propeller separated, and he threw a blade of the propeller. When he did, he pulled the engine out of it. So immediately it was terrifically tail heavy, and he was helpless so far as controlling it was concerned. So he started doing a tail first falling leaf, and it just so happened that of course everybody knew that it was too bad for Tom, but he did a tail first falling leaf, and then the tail would get high, and then the nose would get down, and then tail would get down again. And so happened that the tail got down just before he got to the ground, and he did a falling leaf tail first and just skidded on the ground, and he crawled out of the cockpit without a scratch. And he was cool as a cucumber for about 30 minutes, and then he started shaking. And needless to say, the only parachutes we had in those days were the exhibition type that you tie on and put them in a bag and tie them out on a wing strut and tie them together with a window sash rope. And we used them for exhibition purposes. And then you had a snap on them, and you snap that snap in the ring on the heavy belt. Well, you'd hang down and pull this window sash cord, and that's where you made your parachute jumps. And we always advertised parachute jumps in flying circuses. And if the parachute opened, why, it was a good shoot.
That was how you tested it. About in those early days, was the mortality rate of the pilots tremendously high? I remember you couldn't get insurance.
No, insurance was not available because the general public was considered it just maybe a long trip to suicide. But in the early days of flying, we had to sell the idea, and the way to sell it was when, in fact, that was my job, to go into a city or an airport or an air meet and invite people to take a ride, give them a free ride, and finally we gained confidence. And maybe in some small way we did add something to aviation as it is known today. At least I hope so. Thank you.
I'd like to have some more stories on some of this material that you have here. It looks to me like there's lots more. What is this plane?
That's the plane that I took Eleanor Roosevelt up in.
And what kind is that?
That is Travel Air.
A Travel Air?
Travel Air 6000. It's a Traveler 6000, and that is the very same plane that I took Mrs. Roosevelt up for her first ride. And this picture was taken above the cloud in Wichita. And it's also the same plane that I loaned Lindbergh. And I think I forgot to mention that he picked up Ann, and they flew out to a mountaintop someplace where they had a meadow, but they were both sitting up front and nobody in the rear, so it was naturally light in the tail. And when he landed on this field, he put on his brakes and nosed it over. And I saw a picture in, I believe it was McCall's magazine one time, with this plane lying on its back in this field.
You know, I was thinking they'd gone to Florida. When he was Florida.
I remember in Ann's memoirs something of that, yes, in her book on that. And she told something of the plane that, and yet how he came out of it and didn't.
He bent the rudder, bent the propeller, he bent the propeller, which I think he straightened himself, and he also put a dent in the rudder. And outside of that, he didn't do any damage.
Did he manage to fly it on?
Oh yeah, he flew it back. He flew it back to Wichita.
I thought I remembered that in the story that I had read about Anne. That that was in her memoirs, a book of Anne Morrow's memoirs. We're almost out of tape, and we do want some more stories. You have such a good one.
I don't. Let's turn that off, please.
In talking with Mr. Harned just now, I learned that he has quite a few mementos belonging to his son, Owen Jr. of Dallas. And perhaps among those things is a log book, which would be a very interesting and a most important part of his memorabilia, if it could be located, and if by any chance that Owen Jr. did not care to keep those things, we put in a bid now for our museum in case they can be located. Mr. Harned, tell us something about those early day log books and just what did they contain?
They were the time that we put in on every airplane had a log book. We had to keep record of the time on the motor in the plane and who the pilot was.
And your flight plan?
From and to, yes, only from and to.
That was all.
Yeah. But the hours, that way we knew when to have an oil change, and that's by keeping track of the hours, see, on the motor.
I see. It wasn't your flying time as much as it was the motor's flying time.
Right. And then, too, whoever flew the plane had to sign the log, you see.
Yeah.
Like the sunrise beside Lindbergh.
So the time that Lindbergh flew your plane, then he signed it.
He signed it, Charles A. Lindbergh, and that log disappeared. That is a logbook that tells that it disappeared. Like, we don't know what happened to it. And we looked for it here a while back.
Too far away.
And we looked for it here a while back, and we just don't have it. So I showed that to somebody, and evidently they got away with it. They wanted that signature. So anyhow, we lost the logbook.
And the one with Lindbergh's signature, of course, was very valuable.
That was on this monoplane that he and Ann was in when they nosed it over down there in Mexico.
Yeah,
Well, next to the plane, that's most important now, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And but it's gone, so it's just one of those things.
You know, I've always been sorry I didn't keep that McCall's magazine.
Do you remember anything else that when you sold your home in Stillwater that you probably sent to your son?
We had a trunk full of various things. I don't remember what all it was.
Flying suit, Miss Helen.
Oh, yeah, I had an old heavy flying suit, and it was sheep lined, you know, and my boots, flying boots, they were sheep lined, and a helmet, and goggles, and I don't know.
Probably some pictures of you in your early day flying equipment.
Yeah, he has a picture down there. He had a decoupage. He's got it framed. It must be standing in front of this old airplane.
Travel Air or Jenny?
Jenny.
Well, he decoupaged that hand bill you had on the fly.
Yeah, and then one of our hand bills that we used to on a flying circus, where we'd different businesses, we'd charge them so much, you see, for this advertising. We'd drop out these handbills and put on this show, and I had one of those that we used as crescent, and he put it on a board and decoupaged it. It's really good looking.
Those that was to drum up the crowd for your barnstorming, wasn't it? About how much did you usually make on one of those barnstorming tours?
Oh, we made enough to buy our gasoline and oil, and we make a little. We made sometimes we'd do darn good, and if the town would stand it, we'd charge them $5 a ride. And in those days, we got our gasoline only cost us 14-15 cents a gallon, so.
Those were the days.
So we did all right, and oil was proportionally cheap.
Do you think that our crisis in fuel now is going to affect aviation in any way?
No, I don't think so, other than it might private aviation. They may restrict it, but the jets, I don't think it'll affect them, and they're the ones that's using it up. Now, that I read the other day the plane that they used to transport that Lincoln automobile for the president, it uses 2,000 gallons of gasoline an hour. And the big jets from New York to Los Angeles, well, you use, it depends on the web there, you use between 45 and 60,000 gallons.
They burn kerosene, don't they?
So
Those big planes.
they what?
They burn kerosene, don't they?
No, it's a jet. Well, it's just a whole lot like here. It's jet fuel. It's a little bit higher grade than kerosene.
Maybe it's not as expensive then as.
Well, they've got the price of it up where it's almost as expensive as gas now. The oil companies have gotten rich on it. Yeah. Well, look at the look at the earnings the oil companies have made since.
They weren't hurting, were they?
Oh,
The automobile industry was, but the fuel people.
The refineries, oil companies weren't. And then the sugar companies, they followed suit. And they've made more money in the last year than they ever made in their life. Well, now people have quit using so much sugar, so now they've started lowering the price on it. But I read Kerr McGee's earning.
Yes.
This morning's paper. It's the first time in history that their gross went over $1 billion.
Yes, but you know, you have to defend them. They have to put that money back into exploration for more oil, don't they?
Oh, yes.
Well, I feel like that our country will come out of this all right, but right now the Arabs do have us a little bit by the nape of the neck, don't they?
For an oil cutter, that's what they have.
Well, I think that with as ingenious as American people are, that they'll find something to replace it. I don't think that whenever the petroleum runs out, they'll have something else.
This is the end of my interview with Mr. Harned. Mr. Harned, I surely do thank you. It has been a most interesting experience. And
I didn't,
it's one that'll be very...
This sign-off stops in mid-sentence. Mrs. Roberts apparently ran out of tape before she was able to complete the sign-off for this interview. There are a few sound problems on this tape, but they are on the master tape and could not be corrected in the recopying.